My dad lost our house in a poker game, stole all my college money, beat up my mom, and then made her testify against me. Now I'm going to jail because of him and my mom is out on the street. My dad lost our house in a poker game, stole all my college money, beat up my mom, and then made her testify against me. Now I'm going to jail because of him and my mom is out on the street. Before everything fell apart, before my family became a wreck of betrayal and anger, things were good. Not perfect, but good. My parents, Greg and Sarah, weren't wealthy, but they worked hard. They believed in building a life from the ground up. And they did it together, side by side. Greg was the practical one, always grounded, always steady. He worked at a local hardware store, the kind of job that didn't make you rich but kept the bills paid. His hands were rough, calloused from years of labor, but there was something comforting about those hands. When I was little, I thought they could fix anything. To me, he was this larger-than-life figure, a man who could handle anything thrown his way. Sarah was different. She was the warmth in the room, the light in our little house. She had this way of making the smallest things feel like celebrations. She'd hum old country songs while cooking dinner or laugh over silly things I'd say, her laughter brightening up the whole house. She used to tell me that she and Greg were high school sweethearts. She was the bold one who walked across the gym floor and asked him to dance at their prom. When they first got married, they didn't have much. They started their life together in a tiny one-bedroom apartment with peeling wallpaper and a couch so old it sagged in the middle. But they didn't care. They worked hard, saving every penny they could while dreaming about the day they'd have a home of their own. Mom used to talk about how they scraped by in those early years. Dad would work all day at the hardware store, then pick up odd jobs fixing fences or repairing furniture on weekends. Mom worked nights at a diner, waiting tables until her feet ached. They lived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, pinching every penny until they finally had enough for a down payment on a little house at the edge of town. It wasn't much, a two-bedroom house with creaky floors and a leaky roof, but it was theirs. They painted the walls together, found furniture at garage sales, and turned that house into a home. Mom planted flowers in the yard, and Dad built a swing set in the back. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. When I came along, everything changed. I was their miracle baby. Mom had wanted a child for years but wasn't sure it would happen. When she found out she was pregnant, she cried for hours. Dad joked that he was terrified, but the way he looked at me when I was born told a different story. From the moment I came into the world, they poured everything they had into me. Mom quit her job to stay home with me full-time, while Dad picked up even more shifts at the hardware store. He'd come home exhausted, his shoulders slumped, his boots caked in mud, but he'd always smile when he saw me. "How's my little champ?" he'd say, scooping me up in his arms no matter how tired he was. Mom was the one who kept everything running smoothly. She was the kind of mom who always made time. She taught me how to bake cookies, helped me with school projects, and read me bedtime stories every night. She called me her sunshine boy, always telling me how I lit up her world. I loved our little life. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours. On weekends, Dad would take me fishing down by the river, teaching me how to cast a line and telling me stories about his own childhood. Mom would pack us sandwiches, cutting mine into little triangles because she knew I liked them that way. Birthdays were simple but special. Mom would bake a cake, and Dad would give me a small gift, something thoughtful, like a book or a new soccer ball. They didn't have much to spare, but they always made me feel like I had everything. I was their only child, their pride and joy. Mom told me once that they didn't have another kid because they wanted to give me everything they could. "We didn't need more," she said. "You're enough." As I got older, I started to notice how hard they worked. Dad's hands grew rougher, his face more lined. Mom stopped humming as much, her smile dimming slightly as she stretched the budget tighter and tighter. But they never let me see how tough things really were. When I turned 15, I decided it was time to help out. I got a part-time job at GameStop after school and on weekends. At first, they didn't want me to work. "You should be focusing on school," Dad said, frowning. But I insisted. I wanted to contribute, to take some of the weight off their shoulders. Mom finally gave in. "Just don't let it interfere with your studies," she said, ruffling my hair. I saved every dollar I earned. Some of it went into my college fund, some into a jar I kept on my dresser for emergencies. I wanted to prove I could handle responsibility, that I could be like them, strong, hard-working, dependable. For a long time, it felt like we were winning. We weren't rich, but we were solid. We were happy. And then everything changed. When I turned 16, I decided I wanted to do more than just save money. I wanted to give back to my parents for everything they'd done for me. I couldn't imagine how much they'd sacrificed over the years, working themselves to the bone just to give me a stable home. I looked around our little house and saw all the things that had gone untouched for years: the peeling wallpaper in the living room, the broken hinges on the kitchen cabinets, the way the roof leaked when it rained. I started small. With every paycheck I got from my shifts at GameStop, I set aside a little money for what I called the Fix-It Fund. I didn't tell my parents at first because I wanted it to be a surprise. I'd watch YouTube videos on home repairs during my lunch breaks, learning how to patch drywall, restain wood, and even fix leaky pipes. On weekends, I'd wake up early, put on my oldest clothes, and get to work. The first thing I tackled was the living room. I scraped off the old wallpaper and repainted the walls a soft cream color. It wasn't perfect. There were spots where the paint didn't quite cover evenly, but it made the whole room feel brighter. When my mom saw it, she cried. "You did this?" she asked, running her hand along the freshly painted wall. I shrugged, trying to play it cool. It needed to be done. She hugged me so tightly I thought I might crack. After that, I couldn't stop. I fixed the squeaky hinges on the kitchen cabinets, patched the hole in the bathroom ceiling, and even replaced the broken tiles in the hallway. Bit by bit, the house started to feel new again. My dad noticed too. He wasn't the type to gush, but I'd catch him running his hand over the new tiles or examining the freshly patched ceiling with a nod of approval. One night, after I'd spent the whole day repairing the back steps, he handed me a cold soda and sat down next to me. "You're a good kid, Henry," he said, staring out at the yard. Hearing that meant everything to me. But it wasn't just about the repairs. I wanted to make their lives easier in every way I could. When the holidays came around, I saved up enough to buy them things they'd never buy for themselves. A new pair of work boots for my dad, since his old ones were practically falling apart. A soft fleece blanket for my mom because she always got cold in the winter. Little things, but they meant the world to them. I'll never forget the look on my mom's face when I gave her that blanket. She wrapped it around herself immediately and said, "It's like a hug, Henry. It's like you gave me a hug I can wear." Things were good for a while. We were happy, even if life wasn't perfect. But then Mom got sick. It started small, just a little cough that wouldn't go away. She brushed it off, saying it was nothing, but after a few weeks, the cough turned into something more. She was tired all the time, barely able to get through the day without lying down. When Dad finally convinced her to see a doctor, we found out it was pneumonia. Dad stepped up in a way I'd never seen before. He took time off work, something he never did, to stay home and take care of her. He cooked her meals, brought her tea, and sat by her bedside, reading to her from her favorite books. It was hard watching her like that, so weak, so unlike the strong, lively woman I'd always known. I did everything I could to help. I picked up more shifts at work to cover the bills while Dad stayed home with her. I made her soup, cleaned the house, and kept her company when Dad needed a break. There was one night I'll never forget. It was late, and I'd just finished cleaning up the kitchen. I walked past their bedroom and saw the door was slightly open. Inside, Dad was sitting by Mom's bed, holding her hand. She was asleep, her breathing shallow but steady. Dad just sat there, staring at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. I heard him whisper, "You're gonna be okay, Sarah. You have to be. We need you." In that moment, I saw a side of him I'd never seen before. Raw, vulnerable, utterly devoted. It hit me how much he loved her, how much he'd do to keep her safe. It took months, but Mom eventually got better. She wasn't quite the same, she tired more easily, and her laugh didn't come as quickly as it used to, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. After she recovered, I noticed a shift in Dad. He seemed lighter, happier. He started helping me with the house projects, teaching me little tricks he'd learned over the years. We fixed the leaky roof together, standing side by side on a rickety ladder, laughing when I accidentally dropped a hammer into the bushes. For a while, it felt like we were stronger than ever. We were a team, a family. And I thought nothing could ever tear us apart. I was wrong. After months of worry and sleepless nights, Mom finally recovered from her illness. We thought things would go back to normal, that the warmth and laughter would return to our home. But they didn't. At first, I chalked it up to her needing more time. She had been so sick, so weak, and I figured she just needed to rebuild her strength. But as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that this wasn't just physical recovery. It was something deeper, something harder to heal. Mom stopped humming while she cooked. She stopped cooking altogether, actually. The kitchen, which used to be her domain, now felt empty and cold. She stopped ruffling my hair as she passed by, stopped calling me her sunshine boy. She barely even spoke to Dad. It wasn't that she was angry or mean, she just wasn't there. She'd spend hours staring out the window, lost in her own world. I'd try to talk to her, to ask if she wanted to watch a movie with me or go for a walk, but she'd always say, "Maybe later, Henry." Later never came. I missed her hugs the most. Mom's hugs were like medicine. They could fix anything. A bad day, a scraped knee, a broken heart. Her hugs made it all better. But now they were gone. And without them, our house felt so much colder. Dad tried to act like everything was fine, but I could see the cracks forming. He wasn't the same without Mom's compassion and support. She had always been his rock, the one who kept him grounded when life got tough. Now, he started staying at work later and later. At first, he said it was because the store was short-staffed, but I knew better. He didn't want to come home to the silence, to the empty shell of the woman he loved. One night, I sat down with him in the living room. He was staring at the TV, but I could tell he wasn't really watching it. "Dad," I said, breaking the silence. "What's going on with Mom?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked so much older than he had just a year ago, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "I don't know, Henry," he admitted. She's not herself anymore. It's like she's here, but she's not really here." "Do you think she's mad at us?" I asked, my voice small. "No, son," he said quickly. "This isn't about us. I think she's just hurting. I don't know how to fix it." That's when we decided to take her to a doctor. She didn't want to go at first. She said she was fine, that she just needed more time. But we insisted. The psychiatrist diagnosed her with clinical depression. He explained it to us, how her illness had likely triggered it, how the stress and exhaustion of the past year had taken its toll. He said it wasn't anyone's fault, but that she needed help, real, professional help. We started her on therapy and medication, but the changes were slow. Too slow. Mom still seemed distant, like a part of her had just shut down. She went through the motions, but the spark that made her Sarah, the woman who had held our family together, was gone. And without her, Dad started to unravel. He didn't say it outright, but I could tell he felt like he was failing. He couldn't reach her, couldn't bring her back to the woman he fell in love with. He started coming home later and later, always with some excuse about work. Sometimes, I'd wait up for him, sitting on the couch with the TV on just to keep me company. He'd come through the door looking exhausted, his shirt rumpled, his eyes heavy. "You don't have to wait up, champ," he'd say, ruffling my hair half-heartedly. "I don't mind," I'd reply, but he was already heading to the kitchen for a beer. I hated seeing him like that. I hated seeing her like that. The family that had once been my whole world was crumbling, and I didn't know how to stop it. The house felt so quiet, so heavy. Mom barely left her room. Dad was hardly ever home. And me? I just drifted between the two of them, trying to keep things from falling apart completely. But deep down, I knew I couldn't hold it together on my own. And things were about to get so much worse. I never thought I'd wake up to the smell of gas. At first, I didn't even realize what it was. I was groggy, the kind of half-asleep where your mind doesn't register danger right away. But as I sat up in bed, the heaviness in the air hit me, and suddenly, I was wide awake. My chest felt tight, my head swimming as I stumbled out of my room. The house was silent, too silent. The air was thick, suffocating, and the faint hiss of gas was unmistakable. "Mom!" I called out, my voice cracking. "Dad!" There was no answer. Panic clawed at my throat as I ran to the kitchen. The stove burners were all on, no flames, just gas pouring into the air. My hands shook as I turned the knobs off, one by one. My head was pounding, my lungs screaming for fresh air, but I didn't stop until the gas was off. I opened the windows, coughing as the cold air rushed in. And that's when I saw her. Mom was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the floor. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her face expressionless. She didn't even look up when I called her name again. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Do you have any idea what could have happened?" She didn't answer. I knelt in front of her, grabbing her hands. "Mom, talk to me. Please." Her eyes finally met mine, and the emptiness in them nearly broke me. "I just wanted it to stop," she whispered. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My mom, the strongest person I knew, had given up. She had wanted to end it all. I sat there with her for what felt like hours, holding her hands, trying to think of something, anything to say that might bring her back. But the words wouldn't come. When Dad came home later, I told him what happened. I expected him to get angry, to yell, to blame her. But he didn't. He just stood there, staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "I don't know what to do anymore," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Neither did I. In the days that followed, things didn't get any better. If anything, they got worse. I tried to hold it together. Then came the day I was late for work. I'd stayed up all night, trying to finish a project for school while worrying about Mom. By the time my alarm went off, I was so exhausted that I slept right through it. When I finally showed up at GameStop, my manager was waiting for me. "This is the third time this month, Henry," he said, shaking his head. "I can't keep covering for you." I apologized, tried to explain that things were rough at home, but he didn't care. "We need someone we can rely on," he said. And just like that, I was fired. I didn't tell my parents. I couldn't. Mom was still fragile, and Dad was barely hanging on as it was. I couldn't add another burden to their shoulders. Instead, I started spending my days wandering the streets, trying to avoid going home. I fell in with a group of kids from school who didn't care about much. They smoked, skipped class, and spent their time doing nothing. I didn't even like them, but it was easier than being alone. One of them offered me a joint one afternoon, and for the first time in my life, I said yes. I just wanted to forget everything. The gas, the fights, the feeling that my family was slipping away. It worked. For a little while, I felt numb. But that numbness came at a cost. I started skipping school more often, falling further and further behind. My teachers noticed, of course. They called home, but Dad was working late, and Mom, well, she wasn't in any state to handle it. The final blow came when I failed my math exam. I'd always been good at math. Numbers were the one thing that made sense in my life. But when I saw that big red F on the top of the paper, it felt like confirmation that I was spiraling out of control. When I showed Dad the grade, he didn't even get angry. He just sighed and muttered, "Figures," before walking away. That night, we had another fight. Not about my grades, but about everything. About him staying late at work, about me skipping school, about the fact that our family was falling apart and no one seemed to know how to fix it. "You think I want to stay late?" he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You think I like coming home to this? Maybe if you were actually here once in a while, things wouldn't be such a mess." I shot back. It was the first time I'd ever yelled at him, and the look on his face told me he hadn't seen it coming. "Don't you dare put this on me," he growled. "You think you're the only one struggling? I'm doing the best I can." "So am I," I screamed. But was I? I wasn't so sure anymore. After the fights at home became unbearable and my dad stopped coming back at any reasonable hour, things shifted again. He started drinking after work. It began harmless enough, or at least that's what I told myself. He'd sit around with a couple of his coworkers, have a beer or two, and blow off some steam. For the first time in a long while, he actually seemed relaxed. I wanted to believe it was a good thing. After everything with Mom, maybe he deserved a little break, some time to clear his head. But it didn't take long before the beers turned into something else. One night, I overheard him talking to one of his friends on the phone, laughing and boasting. "Yeah, I cleaned you out last week. Better brush up on your poker face, buddy." Poker. It started as a game. Just something fun to pass the time while they drank, he said. Harmless, he called it. They'd toss a few bucks on the table, deal some cards, and laugh their way through the night. At first, I thought it was good for him. His friends weren't bad guys, they were trying to help him, I realized later. They let him win most nights, sliding money across the table to him, laughing it off like it didn't matter. Maybe they saw how broken he was and figured a few extra bucks in his pocket might lift his spirits. But my dad, he didn't see it like that. He started coming home with stories about how good he was at the game. You should have seen their faces, he'd say, grinning like he'd just won the World Series of poker. They didn't stand a chance. He didn't realize they were letting him win. Or maybe he didn't care. It didn't take long before the game became more than just a game. He started spending more time at these poker nights, coming home later and later, sometimes reeking of alcohol. The excitement in his voice when he talked about poker turned into obsession. He started studying the game, watching videos online, scribbling strategies in an old notebook. He thought he was a natural, some kind of prodigy. Phil Ivey's got nothing on me, he'd say, laughing. But the laughs didn't last. The first time I noticed something was missing from the house, I thought I was imagining it. The new coffee maker I'd bought for Mom with my own money, gone. At first, I assumed it broke and Dad tossed it out, but then more things started disappearing. My old gaming console. It didn't take long to figure out where they'd gone. Where's the toaster? I asked one morning as I rummaged through the cabinets. Dad barely looked up from his plate. Sold it, he said casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Sold it? Why? We didn't need it, he said with a shrug. Besides, I got a good deal for it. I didn't believe him, but I didn't press the issue. Not then. Mom did, though. The first big fight I remember started over the missing items. Where's the vacuum, Greg? Mom asked, her voice steady but sharp. I sold it, he said, not even looking at her. You what? She snapped. Why on earth would you do that? We need that vacuum. He sighed, finally looking up from the table. Sarah, it's just a vacuum. I'll buy another one when I get the money. With what money, Greg? The money you lose at poker every week. The room went dead silent. What's that supposed to mean? Dad asked, his tone defensive. It means you're throwing away what little we have. Mom shot back. It's bad enough you're staying out all night, but now you're selling off our stuff? For what? To gamble it away. Dad stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I'm not gambling it away, Sarah. I'm winning. I'm doing what I have to do to take care of this family. Take care of this family? Mom laughed bitterly. You call this taking care of us? Selling everything we own and coming home drunk half the time. I sat frozen at the kitchen table, my head down, trying to make myself invisible. I don't have to explain myself to you, Dad growled. At least I'm trying to make things better. What have you done lately, huh? Mom flinched, and I felt my blood boil. I wanted to jump up, to say something, but I didn't. I just sat there, gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. The fight ended with Mom storming out of the room and Dad slamming the door behind him. It wasn't the last fight, not by a long shot. As the weeks went on, the house felt like it was shrinking. Every room was full of tension, every conversation a potential explosion. I tried to keep my head down, to stay out of it, but it was impossible. The things I'd worked so hard to buy kept disappearing, and no matter how many times I asked about it, Dad just waved me off. I'll pay you back, he'd say. But he never did. The worst part wasn't the missing stuff or the fights, it was the way the family I'd loved so much was falling apart before my eyes. I couldn't recognize my dad anymore. And my mom. She seemed more distant than ever, like she was building walls to protect herself from the chaos. I started wondering if this was just how life was going to be now. It all started with the house. The house was everything to us, a symbol of the life my parents had worked so hard to build. It wasn't much, just a little two-bedroom with creaky floors and a leaky roof, but it was ours. It was where I grew up, where we celebrated birthdays and Christmases, where we made memories that I thought would last forever. But then my dad got into debt. At first, I didn't know how bad it was. He didn't talk about it, and Mom barely said anything either. She tried to keep things normal, putting on a brave face, but I could see the cracks forming. The unpaid bills piling up on the kitchen counter. The strained look in her eyes every time the phone rang. One day, I overheard them talking in the living room. "You mortgaged the house, Greg." Mom's voice was trembling, somewhere between disbelief and rage. "How could you do this without telling me?" "I had no choice, Sarah," Dad shot back, his tone defensive. "I needed the money." "For what?" she demanded. "For poker." "It's not just poker," he snapped. It's everything. The bills, the car repairs." "Don't lie to me," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "I know what you've been doing. You think I don't see the way you come home smelling like booze, talking about your big wins? You've been gambling it all away." The next few weeks were a blur of tension and arguments. I tried to stay out of it, to focus on school, but it was impossible. The house felt like a ticking time bomb, and every day, I wondered when it would explode. Then it happened. One night, Dad came home drunk. Not the happy drunk he sometimes was after poker night, but angry, seething. His face was flushed, his words slurred, and the moment he walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table, going through the bills. She looked up when he came in, her expression wary. "Greg, where have you been?" she asked. "Out," he muttered, stumbling toward the fridge. "Out where?" "Does it matter?" he snapped, slamming the fridge door shut without even grabbing anything. "Yes, it matters," she said, standing up. "You mortgaged this house, Greg. We're on the verge of losing everything, and you're out drinking and gambling? What's wrong with you?" "Don't start with me, Sarah," he growled, pointing a finger at her. But Mom didn't back down. "No, I'm done staying quiet. You've ruined this family. Do you even care about us anymore?" That's when it happened. In one quick, violent motion, Dad raised his hand and slapped her across the face. The sound echoed through the kitchen, sharp and shocking. Mom stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Don't you ever talk to me like that again," he snarled. I froze. I wanted to do something, to yell, to step between them, but I couldn't move. I just stood there in the doorway, my heart pounding, my stomach in knots. Dad stormed off to the living room, collapsing onto the couch like nothing had happened. Mom stood there for a moment, her hand still on her cheek, tears streaming silently down her face. Then she turned and walked past me, heading to their bedroom without a word. That was the first time. It wasn't the last. The next few weeks were hell. Dad's drinking got worse, and so did his temper. Every little thing seemed to set him off, and Mom bore the brunt of it. He'd come home late, reeking of alcohol, and if dinner wasn't ready or if she dared to ask him where he'd been, he'd lash out. I tried to protect her, to stay up and wait for him so I could intercept him before he got to her. But it didn't always work. And even when I did step in, he'd just turn his anger on me. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he sneered one night, grabbing me by the collar and shoving me against the wall. "You think you're better than me?" I didn't say anything. I couldn't. "You're nothing," he hissed. "Just a spoiled little brat. You wouldn't last a day in the real world." I don't know how long this went on before things escalated again. One night, he came home worse than ever. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements erratic, and he wasn't just angry, he was desperate. "Where's your college money, Henry?" he demanded, his voice slurring. "What?" I stammered, taken off guard. "Your money," he repeated, stepping closer. "Where is it? I know you've been saving. Hand it over." I shook my head, backing away. "No. That money's for school." "You think I care?" he snapped, his face contorting with rage. "I need it." "No. No." I shouted, finally finding my voice. "You're not getting it. You've taken enough from us." His face twisted, and for a moment, I thought he was going to hit me. But then he turned to Mom, who was standing frozen in the corner. "Tell him," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Tell him to give me the money, or I'll make you regret it." "Greg, please," Mom whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Don't do this." "Give them to me," he roared, stepping toward her. The next morning, the police showed up at my school. They pulled me out of class, saying I was being accused of assault. It was Mom, sitting on our couch, a fresh bruise on her cheek. She looked into the camera, her voice trembling as she said, "Henry did this to me." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The officer looked at me with cold eyes. "Your neighbors corroborated the story," he said. "They said they saw you hit her." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It didn't make sense. My own mother, how could she say that? But deep down, I knew why. She was trying to protect me. She knew what he was capable of, knew he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. If I stayed, he might kill me. And so, I didn't fight. I let them take me away. No one at school believed it. Not my classmates, not my teachers, not even the janitor who barely knew my name. Everyone had seen the bruises my mom wore, heard the shouting that echoed down the street at night. They knew what kind of man my dad had become. But none of that mattered when the police showed up at my school, handcuffed me, and led me out like I was some kind of criminal. I'll never forget the looks on their faces, the shock, the pity, the disbelief. I kept my head down, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. All I could think about was how this wasn't just my dad's doing. It was a betrayal from my mom too. She had lied to protect me. I knew that. I knew she'd sat in front of that camera and told them I hit her because she thought it was the only way to save me. But it didn't make it hurt any less. At the station, they questioned me for hours. They showed me the footage again and again, as if playing it on repeat would somehow make it true. My mom's trembling voice, her blood wounds, the words, "Henry did this to me." I denied it, of course. Over and over, I told them it wasn't true, that my dad had done this, not me. But they didn't care. They had her statement, and that was enough for them. When I was finally released on bail, I found out how deep my dad's manipulation ran. It wasn't just my mom's testimony. He had neighbors claiming they'd seen me hit her, heard me shouting at her late at night. I didn't know how he did it, but it wasn't hard to figure out. He must have bribed them, scared them, or maybe promised them favors from the police. It was devastating. Everyone on the block knew the truth. They'd heard him screaming at her, seen him come home drunk and angry. Some had even tried to intervene before. But now, suddenly, they were all silent. At school, though, things were different. My classmates weren't stupid. They'd seen my dad yelling at me in the driveway, seen my mom flinch when someone asked her how she got those bruises. They knew I wasn't the kind of person to hurt anyone, let alone my own mother. My class teacher, Ms. Harper, pulled me aside one day after school. "Henry," she said gently, "if there's anything you need, anything at all, you let me know, okay? I don't believe a word of what they're saying." Her kindness brought tears to my eyes, but I held them back. I couldn't let myself cry. Not yet. The support from my classmates was overwhelming too. They started leaving notes in my locker, little messages like, "Stay strong," and "We've got your back." My best friend from childhood, Marcus, even showed up at my house one evening. "Henry," he said as we sat in my room, "I don't believe it. Not for a second." He'd been my friend since we were 5, and if anyone knew the truth, it was him. "Thanks," I muttered, barely able to meet his eyes. "I mean it," he said firmly. "I know your dad's a piece of work, but this is next level." That's when he told me something I didn't know, something that sent a chill down my spine. "Your dad works for the police, right?" "What?" I asked, blinking in confusion. "He's a cop," Marcus said. "I heard it from my dad. He said your dad's been with the department for years." It all made sense. How else could he have orchestrated everything so perfectly? The fake witnesses, the neighbor's sudden change of heart, the fact that no one seemed to care about the truth. He wasn't just some drunk dad who'd lost his way. He was a cop. He had connections, power, and the ability to make people do what he wanted. "I'm screwed," I muttered, burying my face in my hands. "No, you're not," Marcus said. "Listen, my dad's got a friend who's a lawyer. I can talk to him, see if he'll help you." I looked up at him, surprised. "You'd do that?" "Of course," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "You're my best friend." The next day, Marcus showed up with more than just words. He brought me a name, a phone number, and a promise. "Call him," he said, pressing a piece of paper into my hand. The lawyer, Mr. Daniels, was skeptical at first. "These kinds of cases are tricky," he told me over the phone. "Especially with your dad. But if you're telling the truth, I'll fight for you." For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Marcus also urged me to testify. "You've got to tell them everything, Henry. What he's done to your mom, to you. Don't hold back." It wasn't easy. The thought of sitting in a courtroom, laying out all the ugliness of my family's life for strangers to hear, terrified me. But Marcus was right. If I stayed silent, my dad would win. With Marcus and Mr. Daniels by my side, I started to believe I might actually have a chance. The day of the hearing felt like walking into a nightmare. The prosecutor stood tall and confident, with that smug air of someone who thought the case was already won. And why wouldn't he? He had everything he needed to paint me as the monster my dad wanted everyone to believe I was. "We have conclusive evidence," the prosecutor began, his voice steady and deliberate. "The victim, Sarah, has provided a clear testimony identifying her attacker. Multiple neighbors have corroborated this account, claiming they heard and saw the defendant engaging in violent behavior." He held up a stack of photos, each one like a slap in the face. Pictures of my mom's bruised face, the swelling around her eye, the marks on her arms. "These images," he said, pacing in front of the courtroom, "show the brutality of this attack. They were taken within hours of the incident. Additionally, we found fingerprints at the scene, fingerprints that belonged to the defendant. Of course they found my fingerprints. It was my house. My hands had touched every surface, every doorframe, every piece of furniture. But sitting there, watching him lay it all out like some kind of airtight case, I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. I glanced at my mom, sitting in the back corner of the room, her face pale and drawn. She wouldn't look at me. She just stared down at her hands, twisting a tissue between her fingers. "Henry," Mr. Daniels whispered, leaning toward me. "Stay calm. Don't let them rattle you." But I was rattled. My whole life was on trial, and every word out of the prosecutor's mouth felt like another nail in my coffin. "Your Honor," he continued, turning to the judge, "this is not a complicated case. We have a clear victim. We have witnesses who saw the defendant's aggressive behavior on multiple occasions. We have physical evidence tying him to the scene. This young man may present himself as a victim, but the evidence speaks for itself." I wanted to scream, to shout that it wasn't true, that my dad was the real monster here. But the words caught in my throat. What good would it do? They had her testimony, the neighbors' lies, the photos, everything. And what did I have? Nothing. I could feel the pressure building inside me, like a dam about to burst. My heart was pounding, my palms slick with sweat. The room felt too small, too hot, and the prosecutor's voice droned on like the hum of a wasp circling my head. "Henry," Mr. Daniels said again, more firmly this time. "Look at me." I turned to him, barely able to focus. "We're not done yet," he said. "This isn't over." But it felt over. After the prosecutor sat down, Mr. Daniels stood up to cross-examine the witnesses. The neighbors took the stand, one after another, each repeating the same story. They said they heard shouting, saw me yelling at my mom, even claimed they'd seen me raise my hand to her. "We only want to tell the truth," one of them said, her voice syrupy with fake concern. Mr. Daniels tried to poke holes in their stories, pointing out inconsistencies, asking why no one had ever called the police before if they were so concerned. But they stuck to their lies, stone-faced and rehearsed. By the time my mom took the stand, I was barely holding it together. She looked so small sitting there, her hands trembling as she held onto the edges of the chair. The prosecutor guided her through her testimony, asking her to recount the attack in detail. Her voice was quiet, shaky, and every word felt like a dagger to my chest. He was angry," she said, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. "We argued, and then he hit me. I wanted to shout, 'Tell the truth. Tell them it was Dad.' But I couldn't. She wouldn't." When Mr. Daniels questioned her, he tried to push gently, asking her if she felt pressured to make the statement, if anyone had influenced her testimony. But she just shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "No," she said. This is what happened." Her voice, by the time the hearing adjourned for the day, I was completely drained. I sat in the empty courtroom long after everyone else had left, staring at the table in front of me. My head was spinning, my chest tight with anxiety. What if they're right? I whispered to Mr. Daniels as he gathered his papers. He stopped, turning to look at me. "Henry, they're not right. You didn't do this." "But they have everything," I said, my voice shaking. "The pictures, the fingerprints, the witnesses. How can I fight that?" He put a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. "We fight it with the truth. Your dad's been pulling the strings, but he's not as untouchable as he thinks he is. We're going to find the cracks in his story, and when we do, everything will fall apart." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as I sat there, the weight of the prosecutor's words still ringing in my ears, all I could think was that maybe it didn't matter. Maybe my dad had already won. The courtroom was silent, the air so heavy with tension it felt like you could cut it with a knife. I sat there, my hands trembling under the table, barely able to breathe. The prosecutor had painted me as a villain, a monster, and for all their lies, it seemed like they had convinced everyone in the room. Then came the moment I dreaded most. My mom was called back to the stand. She walked up slowly, her shoulders slumped, her face pale and tired. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, like the weight of everything was crushing her from the inside out. When she sat down, she wouldn't meet my eyes. The prosecutor asked her a few more questions, all carefully worded to reinforce their story. Mom answered quietly, her voice trembling but steady enough to keep the illusion intact. She stuck to the script, just like before, repeating the lies my dad had forced her to tell. I sat there, my heart breaking with every word. Then it was Mr. Daniels' turn. He stood up slowly, his expression calm but focused. He didn't rush, didn't dive into a list of questions to poke holes in her testimony. Instead, he asked just one question. "Sarah," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "do you love your son?" For a moment, the room felt frozen in time. My mom sat there, staring down at her hands, the tension in her body visible even from where I was sitting. She didn't say anything. "Sarah," Mr. Daniels repeated, his voice softer now, "do you love Henry?" That was it. That was all it took. She broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she let out a sob that seemed to echo through the room. She covered her face with her hands, shaking her head, and then she screamed. "Henry, forgive me," she cried, her voice raw and full of pain. "I didn't want this. I didn't want it to end like this." My chest tightened as I watched her unravel, the truth pouring out in a torrent of words she couldn't hold back anymore. "I thought your father would get better," she wailed. "I thought he'd stop. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I did what he said, he'd change. But he didn't. He only got worse." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but I couldn't hear them. All I could focus on was my mom, her face streaked with tears, her voice cracking as she let the weight of everything she'd been carrying spill out. "I can't keep quiet anymore," she shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. "It wasn't Henry. It was Greg. He did this to me. He made me lie. He threatened me, said he'd hurt me if I didn't do what he wanted. But I can't do it anymore. I can't let my son take the fall for what that man did." The prosecutor stood, his face a mix of shock and frustration. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." The judge held up a hand, silencing him. "Let her finish." Mom turned to me then, her eyes red and swollen, but filled with a desperate kind of love. "Henry," she said softly, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I kept you away from him, he wouldn't hurt you the way he hurt me. But I was wrong. I see that now. I should have told the truth from the beginning." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at her, my mind reeling as the weight of her words sank in. The room was completely still, every eye on my mom as she confessed everything. She told them about the years of abuse, the threats, the lies, and how my dad had manipulated her into framing me to cover his own tracks. She didn't hold anything back. When she was done, the courtroom erupted into chaos. The prosecutor tried to salvage his case, but it was too late. The truth was out. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a spark of hope. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath as my mom's words settled over everyone. It was as if time had stopped. My dad wasn't there to defend himself. He never bothered to show up in court, thinking he had it all under control. But the weight, Mr. Daniels took over, weaving my mom's testimony into a damning case against my dad. He pointed out the inconsistencies in the neighbors' stories, highlighting how none of them had ever reported seeing me act aggressively before. He exposed how fingerprints in my own home meant nothing and drove home the evidence of abuse my mom had bravely recounted. Within days, my dad was arrested. When the police came to our house to take him in, it was like watching a movie. He stood there, defiant, shouting about how he was being set up. "You think you can do this to me?" he spat at the officers. "I'm one of you." But no one cared. As they cuffed him, he turned to me, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think this makes you a man, Henry? Taking your old man down? You'll never amount to anything." I didn't respond. For once, his words didn't cut me. Because in that moment, I knew he was wrong. When the trial concluded, my dad was sentenced to prison for assault, coercion, and conspiracy. He wasn't untouchable after all. But even after justice was served, life didn't magically get better. The damage he caused didn't just disappear. With Dad gone, we were left with nothing. He had drained every penny we had, sold off anything of value, and the mortgage he'd taken out on the house was overdue. The bank repossessed it within weeks. Mom and I were homeless. For a while, we lived in our car, parked in quiet streets or behind grocery stores where no one would bother us. Mom was fragile, still recovering from years of trauma, and I felt like I had to be the strong one. I didn't tell her, but there were nights when I'd cry myself to sleep, wondering if this was it, if this was the life we were stuck with now. But then help came from an unexpected place. Marcus, my childhood friend, showed up one evening while we were sitting in the car, eating takeout we could barely afford. He knocked on the window, startling both of us, and when I rolled it down, he gave me that same grin he'd had since we were kids. "Get your stuff," he said simply. "What?" I asked, confused. "You're not staying here," he said. "My mom and dad have a guest room, and they're not taking no for an answer." I tried to argue, to say we didn't want to impose, but he wouldn't hear it. "You'd do it for me, wouldn't you?" he said, crossing his arms. "So shut up and let us help." That night, Mom and I moved into Marcus's house. His parents treated us like family, never once making us feel like a burden. Mom started going to therapy regularly, working through the years of pain she'd endured. And me? I picked up the pieces of my life, one by one. I got a part-time job again, saved every penny I could, and eventually enrolled in community college. It wasn't the big university I dreamed of, but it was a fresh start, and that was enough. Years later, things finally felt normal. Mom found a small apartment of her own, a place she could call her own without fear or pain. I graduated college and got a decent job. And Marcus, he stayed my best friend through it all, a constant reminder that even in the darkest times, there are people who won't let you fall. I met my wife not long after I started working, a woman who understood struggle and strength in equal measure. She was the daughter of one of the officers who had helped put my dad behind bars, and from the moment we met, it felt like fate. Sometimes, I think back to those nights in the car, wondering how we made it out of that darkness. The truth is, I don't know if I would have without the people who stood by me. Marcus, his family, Mr. Daniels, and even my mom, who found the courage to break free and tell the truth. I learned that survival isn't just about strength. It's about who you let in, who you trust to help you when you can't stand on your own. And for that, I'm grateful. As for my dad, I don't think about him much anymore. He's just a ghost from a life I've left behind. The life